It's me again. You remember me, don't you? We met at that diner a few weeks ago. Wait, no, that's not you. That's a. Never mind. Never mind. Never mind. You didn't hear me say anything about me meeting another muse. Just didn't happen. Didn't happen. How are ya? You doing good? Good. Because I have something good to talk to you about. Good? Good? We all good? Awesome. All right, so recently someone asked me a question, and I thought I would address it with you, Muse. And the question was pretty simple. The answer was not. But anyway, the question was, what do you do as a writer when you're fairly certain the book that you're writing has kind of just gone off the rails? That you've lost your way. Well, okay, so there's a really famous writer. And this famous writer, I'm not going to name any names, but this famous writer is a really, really well-established and really good writer. Brilliant writer. In fact, this writer had a particular book in a certain genre that pretty much redefined the genre. That's how good this writer is. Now, thing is with almost every one of this writer's books, you could take about the middle quarter of these books and tear them out, and you have an improved story. Why? Because for some odd reason, in the middle of this writer's books, they always seem to take on this tangent. And that tangent, generally speaking, has to do with the history of a family member or some such. And it can be distracting, and it can also cause readers to lose track of what's happening. You're going along, and all of a sudden the writer takes this right turn, this 90-degree right turn off into this other area, and then you're all of a sudden feel like you're reading a different book. And then a few hundred pages later, they come back to the main storyline and trudge forward. Okay, that's one way to write a book. You can write a book like that, okay? I don't suggest it. Now, the way I see the arc of a book is simple. Now, in its most basic form, you have a book that goes from point A to point Z, okay? Point A is the starting of the book, and point Z is where you want the characters to be in the end. And typically, that arc looks something like this. It goes up, and then it hits the little climax up here, and then it has the little denouement, and it goes down to the finish, the big jazz hands kind of finish. Now, that's not how I write. I tend to write with a consistent climbing action that allows for dips and valleys like this. It goes up, and it goes down a little bit, and then it goes up again, and it goes down a little bit, and then it goes up. Because if you just keep going like this, you're going to wind up causing the readers to be out of breath and exhausted by the time they reach the climax. Don't take it there. Keep your mind out of the gutter, Muse. Anyway, so everybody knows, or anybody that ever talks to me about writing knows, that I write without a net. I don't plan books. Now, I'm going to make a confession here. This is a pretty big confession. A lot of times when I start writing a book, I have no idea how it's going to end. None. So I have point A, and then I have this kind of black hole over here that says somehow the book's going to end. I don't know how or why or where, but it's going to end over here. And I throw myself into it, and I let the rise and fall of the narrative happen naturally. And that's why I say that most of the times I let the characters write the book. Because what they do, it's very, and I've said this before, it's very cause and effect. I write with a very butterfly effect style, wherein A causes B, causes C, causes D, causes E, and usually what that does is it allows the narrative to happen organically. Now, there are other writers and I have done this before. I have written a book where I have known point A and I have known point Z. I knew exactly how I wanted this book to end. So all I had to do was make sure that somewhere up here, point Q or S or whatever, was pretty high, and then it could come back down to point Z. But the thing is that, and this is one of the reasons why I don't recommend that new writers write without a net. I recommend that new writers always use an outline, because until you have a grasp on this kind of cause and effect technique, what's going to happen is you're not going to necessarily trust your instincts as much. And the effect from the cause might take that right turn, right? So the cause from the effect has to be natural. And what happens is that when you take that effect in an unnatural way, for example, you make a character do something that is outside of their character, outside of what of their universe, of what they believe, of what they think, of how they act. If it's not, if it's tangential to who they are, if it's like, this is the universe of this character, and typically our universes are pretty small, and they do something, they do A, and you make the effect of A live outside of their universe, you have made that arc take a right turn. Now, that's not to mean you can't have a character do something out of character, because you can and you should. But it has to stay within the realm of possibility. Right? You need to be able to pretty easily justify why a character would do something. You can't have this, let's just say for example, you cannot have, let's just say you have this really strong, effective main character that always seems to get their way. Even by force of will, by force of nature, whatever, they always get their way. And then for some reason you decide, let's throw this person into a situation where they don't get their way. And when they do that, you have them react completely differently than they have reacted throughout the whole book. All of a sudden they're acting out of character. And they do so in such a way that's just not believable. What's going to happen then is that storyline is going to take a right turn. And if you allow that right turn to go on long enough, you're going to have trouble getting back to the main narrative. And that's what's truly important about this, is you have to always be able to make it back to the main narrative of the story. Going from point A to point Z is the thrust of the book. Along that path, those little peaks and valleys, are you going, okay, let's take a little side trip, but that little side trip has to do with the main arc. And that, what happens is when you have this main arc and you take these little side trips that have nothing to do with the main story, then you're causing yourself problems. And if that happens too often, and if you allow those little side trips to take on a life of their own, then you're going to cause chaos and confusion in your storyline. That's why I always make sure that every little side trek that a character takes has to do directly with the main story. Everything in this book should relate somehow to this main story. And that's why one of the problems I always had with that one writer that I was talking about is because sometimes that quarter chunk of the book doesn't always have to do with the main storyline. It's almost like the writer is trying to plant the seeds of something that's going to happen in another book in a different series. And that's great if you can pull it off, if you're creating this sort of metaverse thing. But even then, sometimes, if you're writing your book, this novel, if you're writing this novel, and you're going along, you say, ooh, it would be really cool or fun or whatever to take this character off on this side trip that has nothing to do with the main story. Let me give you a little tip here. Instead of doing that in the world of this book, write a spin-off. Write a spin-off novella series of sidetracks for this character. Because if you have too many sidetracks, it's just going to be confusing to the reader. So, for new writers, I truly do believe it is best, and I did this when I first started writing. I wrote with an outline. I plotted out the book, and I'll tell you how I did it. This is how I introduced myself to writing. I had no idea what I was doing. I truly didn't. I just knew that I had the capability of telling stories. And I because of my theater background and my improv background, I was able to write good dialogue. So what I did when I wrote my first book was I knew what I wanted the book to be about. And I knew my main characters. And so for every chapter of the book, I wrote a paragraph that described the chapter. So for each paragraph, each chapter, I'd have a paragraph that would describe what happened in that chapter. And I went through and I did this organically. So I wrote the outline organically. I didn't have a sort of narrative outline. So it was like a sentence for each chapter, and then I fleshed it out. I just wrote a paragraph, and that paragraph would go, oh, this happened in this paragraph. What happens if I do this in this chapter? So in the end, I had written the book. It was just a very short form of the book in such that each chapter was nothing but a paragraph. So all I had to do when I went back to write it was flesh out each paragraph. Now, one of the things that I realized very early on was that I would go back through that outline and I would see that I had written a paragraph or a chapter that seemed out of place. And when I got to write that chapter out, I had to rewrite that paragraph such that it was in place, such that it fit within the realm of the book, of the arc, of the story. Because I couldn't have this really nice flowy story arc and then take a big old dip just so the character can go have a date that had absolutely nothing to do with the storyline. Now, of course, it's great to send your characters out on dates, but just make sure that it, even indirectly, has something to do with the storyline. Here's a good example. And there are some television shows that do this really, really well. So you have a television show and you have this one character that's within an episode and they have a lesson to learn. Okay? And they have a very important lesson to learn. Now, let's just say it is a medical TV show. So you have this medical TV show and you have this intern who has a case that they're really struggling with, right? And so there's a scene within the same episode of the character having a date with somebody. Now, of course, they're on a date, but their mind is still on this patient. So they're talking with this date, and through the dialogue of this date, you know what's coming here, they realize what they have to do to make the patient better. So that date indirectly related to the main storyline. That is how you do a right turn in a novel. You make it relate directly or indirectly to the storyline. So when you find yourself writing your book and you all of a sudden feel like, I think I've misguided my characters, or I have done something wrong with this storyline. Step back and say, what is my point A to point Z? And how does this little field trip that I've taken the characters on, does it relate to the main storyline If it does, how does it relate? If it doesn't, what can I do to make it relate? And if you can do that, what will happen is if you realize that this little field trip doesn't relate to the main storyline, and you figure out a way to make it relate to the storyline, more than likely what's going to happen is your character is going to learn something, or the little shortcut's going to be shorter than you originally thought, or some new plot point is going to come out that will inform the main plot point. But truly, the most important thing is that anytime you find yourself off the beaten path of your storyline, you got to step back and go, what's going on? How do I fix this? And how do I make it relate to the main storyline if I broke it? It's actually really simple. So just keep that in the back of your mind as you write your novel. Always make sure everything relates to the main storyline. Know your A to Z. When you're early on, as a young writer, make sure you know your A to Z. Once you get a little more experienced, you can not necessarily know that Z. And I personally, I find a lot of joy in that style of writing because I get to take the journey in similar fashion than the reader does, because I don't know how it's going to end. And I've had some of the greatest epiphanies in this manner. As I'm writing along, I'm getting near the end. It's like, oh, that's how it ends. And it's a great feeling as a writer to have that just happen organically and to get that feeling of, wow, I did this. I wrote this storyline such that it even excited and surprised me. So to all young writers, you will get to that point. You just have to take your time and you have to understand how to write organically. But in the meantime, do your outlines and always make sure that your little field trips that you send your characters on relate in some way to the main story. And that's all I had to say to you today, Muse. I know it was a lot to take in, but sometimes you just gotta suffer for your art. Right, Muse? And you do it well. Why? Because you are awesome!